So this is the original linkage for the clutch pedal. It was from the original 66 Mustang that all this came out of. It's pretty heavily worn. I could replace it all, but I still have to come up with brackets in order to get this to pivot off of this frame. And I need to come up with a pedal system that goes underneath the dash. So by the time I started looking at all that and what it was going to take to get from the pedal in the dash to this bracket and figure out all that geometry, I started looking at other options. What was going to be the easiest way to set up this clutch? And my first thought was, we'll get a cable. A cable clutch system, and put a cable through that fork and I can pull it. That's great on like a T6 5-speed transmission because it actually pulls this way. There's a little bracket here, put the cable through and it pulls in the clutch. There's probably a way to rig this one up that pulls in the opposite direction, but the problem with the cables is this has a race clutch in it, and they're pretty stiff springs, so it takes a lot of foot pressure to push in that cable. So I started thinking about hydraulics. Hydraulics is what a lot of the newer cars use, and there are several options for doing hydraulic slave cylinders and master cylinders. Pretty common on a lot of the T5s. And people have brought up, why did you use this transmission? While you're doing all this, why didn't you just put in a 5-speed stick instead of going with this old 4-speed? And that was definitely something to consider. Well, cost was one. This came with it. And two, this being a Willys Jeepster, it doesn't have windows, and there is an option where you can put in vinyl windows like a Jeep, vinyl top. You're not going to go 80 miles an hour for a long period of time in this car. It's just going to be miserable with the flapping windows, and since I'm not planning on putting windows in it, then it's going to even be more miserable with all the wind noise. Put the top down, relax. I don't need to be going freeway speeds all the time. This is going to be a run around town car. And even if I ever sold it, these original Jeepsters didn't go over 45, 50 miles an hour to begin with. So, with keeping that in mind, it's going to be a whole lot of fun to drive. I don't need to go into overdrive to save on gas mileage or to go 100 miles an hour. So, back to the whole idea of hydraulic clutch. There's pull systems and there's push systems. Going back to the T5 overdrive transmission, that clutch goes this way. So you put a bracket here and you do a push slave cylinder, and it pushes that clutch fork. This one, on the other hand, to do a push from this side, it's going to be really difficult to put together any bracketry to be able to push that. And you want all the bracketry to be mounted to the engine and transmission, so that as that engine and transmission shimmies and shakes, you'll screw up your clutch system. It'll just add that much more wear and tear for all the vibration and the misalignment as it's moving things around. So, for this, I need to pull it. I found this Willwood system for pulling a clutch. It mounts in this way. I need to rig up bracketry so that it's mounted to the transmission so that I can pull this ram through a hydraulic master cylinder. I've got my cable, and because this car no longer has a clutch, the prior owner 30, 40 years ago, they cut the clutch pedal off and they cut off all the linkage when they put an automatic in this. So I need to put in another pedal. This is by far the simplest way to do it. Very easy. Put this pedal under the dash. I've got another one just like it for the brake because I'm upgrading all the brake system. And then I can add this master cylinder to the firewall, run the cable down to the slave cylinder, and it's going to be pretty simple. And it really wasn't that expensive. About $100 for the pedal. I believe this was around $80, and I'd have to look this up, but I think it's about the same thing. So I'm looking at $250 and a whole lot less headache. So let's look at what I need to do to rig up bracketry to this transmission so that the vibration will keep this longevity and not have it binding up and wearing out. So this started out what I thought would be fairly simple. It really wasn't. This end needs to go through that fork, so I drilled it out. It is conicaled in for the fork rod to press on and not be slipping out. So they include this little rounded washer so that when this pivots, as this moves in and out, that slides inside of that spherical end. So that works out great. Part of the adjustment for these is where the center point is of this arm is where you need to figure is 0 alignment. So from there, it's 90 degrees with this rod, so that when it's all the way engaged, it is on an angle this way, and then when it's fully disengaged, it's on an angle the opposite direction. Then you're not putting added torque and torsion on the sides of this rod. And how this works is this end is what actually moves. So the hose to the master goes to this side. This is the bleeder hose. That's another area of issue that people have been talking about, is not getting all of the air out of this. A lot of them, this one is pretty level, but it's still slightly going uphill. The air is going to be on this end of the ram. So to get that air out, it's very difficult. You actually need to bleed it off of the car to get all of the air out of the line. So with that in mind, I spent many hours building a bracket for this. It took a lot longer than I thought. I gave up on trying to do a video on all of it. It was a lot of trial and error. There was a lot of pieces I threw away. This just kept evolving to the point where I finally have it, and I'm very comfortable with the way this is mounted. So it is mounted to the transmission mount and to the front of the transmission bell housing connection. That's the way the instructions call it out. So I feel very good about this. Let me show you how I actually got it there. So building a bracket to be able to pull a clutch fork and mount it to the side of the transmission sounds pretty simple. Well, it wasn't. The amount of work that went into this, several hours, and playing with different designs and styles and different materials, what I finally came up with is I had some bar stock. This piece was already had a nice radius to it, so to mount that to the tail of the transmission, mount this to the front of the transmission, this piece was really difficult. The transmission angles a little bit this way, a 90-degree bend here. I needed it to twist and come out this way flat. Luckily I had a torch. I was able to heat all this up, get it red hot, put it in my vise. I was surprised how easy it was to bend, but when I tried to bend this without heating it up, I was hitting it with a sledgehammer. Hardly even bent this at all. It's amazing how strong this bar stock is. I drilled a couple holes in it, so then my idea was this would mount right here. Great idea. But boy, did I run into a lot of problems. So one of the things that I was trying to decide is how much force does this have? Reading online, 150 pounds of force. So I don't need extremely heavy duty pieces, but the way this was mounted and getting this positioned right and not having it drag and not having it bind up, this was too close to the transmission. So then I started looking at, well, how do I get it over here? I want it pivoting over here. What do I mount to this that's going to be strong enough and not going to break loose? Well, I just end up coming up with the idea of flipping this piece around, and I had to bend this down to get it under the transmission. So this mounts to the transmission mount. This mounts to the front of the transmission. This piece then I can mount up underneath, but it just barely clears the exhaust. And then, since this bracket came out beyond, then it gave me that clearance and pivot point, and this gave me a lot of strength. I was surprised how strong all this was. It clears the transmission shift linkage, it clears the bottom of the transmission, gives me distance here, it gives me distance from the pipe. So I'll get this all mounted up and I'll show you how it finally ended up. But wow, what a lot of mind work and labor and thought that went into making all this work. But I think it's going to be excellent. So there was 2 holes I bolted here together so that this was all one piece. And then I wanted to run a larger bolt here that this would actually ride on. Well, the geometry was off. It was too far over. 100 pounds of pressure on this piece that came around here and then back again. There was a lot of movement here. There was a lot of stress and movement that I just couldn't seem to nail down and make it solid enough. So when I started experimenting with moving this around this way, then I realized, oh, well, this is poking out further now. It's not interfering with the exhaust, which it was when it was flexing. It was thumping on that exhaust. So now by reversing it, and it moves this pivot point out a ways, now that pivot point and the angle is where it should be. Now with the travel, it's running in that area where I shouldn't be binding up and wearing this thing out. So then I started getting into, well, I've got it too high because my floorboard is right here. And then these are interfering with the floorboard. So then I had to lower it down and lower it down to the point where it is almost touching the exhaust again. There's enough space there with the vibration. This exhaust is mounted solid to the motor with that header. So I'm not getting a whole lot of variation between the exhaust and this bracket. But now I've got the potential of heat. I don't want to get this hot. I've had hydraulic clutches get hot and boil and they fail. So I'm going to build a heat shield right here. I'll just rig up a heat shield that'll give me a few inches of space on both sides of both the shield, the exhaust, as well as the shield and this slave cylinder. So in the end, I feel very good about this now. I got my angles, my pivot points, my brackets are very solid, but I am very confident now that I have this all rigged up and it's plenty strong enough for the pressures that that clutch pedal will be pushing. So I was experimenting with several different ways of providing a heat shield, and what I did is I took a piece of the 2.5 inch exhaust, trimmed it, opened it up just a little bit, and created a rounded heat shield that I can put in place that will protect that slave cylinder as much as possible. It gives me about an inch and a half clearance between the shield and the exhaust, so that should be adequate. Let's put this all back together and then let's talk about the slave cylinder and how it's adjusted and how it's used. Alright, so now you can see I can get my fingers in there. There's plenty of airspace there. Heat can get around it, but no real direct heat. So that worked out great. As I talked about before, I've got good travel here now, so that when this pulls. And one of the things you have to be mindful of when it comes to a hydraulic clutch versus a mechanical clutch is the ability to adjust it. Some of the hydraulic clutches, like a hydraulic throwout bearing, those throwout bearings, you can't really get in there and adjust it. So as the clutch wears out and that throwout bearing, where those fingers are, as it wears, the fingers come out. So the throwout bearing has to have a gap, and that gap has to be measured in a way that over time, as the clutch wears, you have that space so that once those forks hit it, it's going to start slipping if you don't have enough room. Well, the beauty of this is you can adjust it. So I could leave a lot of play in that clutch, but I only have an inch and a half travel in the clutch slave cylinder when it is pulled in all the way. So you want to adjust the fork so that it is actually touching the fingers of the clutch, but you don't want it too tight, because then as the clutch wears, you'll start to slip. But the nice thing about this having full adjustment is you can periodically check that, make sure you got a little bit of movement, and then readjust that pivot point. So it's pretty cool having this external that way, and then you get all the benefits of a hydraulic clutch to give you a real smooth, full feel of the pedal without the fatigue of pushing a heavy-duty clutch like a racing clutch. So that wraps up this chassis. The only thing I have left now is the studs. These studs for the disc brakes and the combination of the new wheels, those studs were about 1/4 inch too short. So I knocked them all out, ordered some new ones, and as soon as those come in, I will drive in those new studs. And then I just throw a tarp over this chassis, set it aside, and start working on the body.